very much for that, Cleona. And I'm going to move on at this point to our second speaker of the morning, because we're just joined here also online with Richard Hogan. Now, so Dr. Richard Hogan is the Clinical Director at the Therapy Institute. And Richard is also the author of Home is Where the Start Is. And in fact, that's actually the title of your own talk today. And I think that you're planning to focus on the impact of addiction on child development. So Richard, I'll hand over to you at this point. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sheila. And that was a great presentation by Cleena there. I suppose what I'm going to talk about here is, I've been a teacher, I've been a principal, I'm a psychotherapist. I write for the Irish Examiner. So, I grew up in a family where my father was a journalist for the Irish Times. It was the head Munster correspondent in the 1970s and 80s. I want to speak about my own experience growing up because I never really mentioned it to anybody for a long time. And I never really spoke about it until I wrote Home Was Where the Start Is in 2023. And in that, when I was writing that book about, the family you come from, the early attachments, your relationship with your peers, your relationship with where you come in the family, I was looking at all the idea about the story that we tell ourselves about who we are, where does that come from? And as I was writing that book, my own story started to come up, and I started talking about my own. It just started to happen. My own child. I was writing about my own childhood and my own childhood experiences. And as I was writing the book, which is always what happens when you're writing a book, a different book emerges. You have an idea of a book, but a different book comes out of it. And at the end, you kind of feel, oh my God, that was the book that was waiting to be written. I didn't realize that at the time. And so I wove my own story in and out of this book that was about the theory of how to thrive in life. That was really what I was trying to get to, that we all come out of messy families. Here's how how you can thrive. Here's some ways of dealing with maybe some early childhood experiences that might have been adverse. But as I was writing the story, my own story kept weaving into it. And I started the book, with an anecdote. When I was 15, my mother asked me, did I want to go and see a psychiatrist because my mood was low? And I thought this would be a great moment because I hadn't spoken to anyone about what has been going on in our family. I'd kept that secret, like most families are. Families are very secretive places. There's nothing more complicated than the family system. There's nothing more complicated than the family you come out of. And so I held that secret like everybody else holds a secret about their families. And this was like early 90s. And we were in the psychiatrist's waiting office. And the secretary said to me, no, I can't remember the psychiatrist's name. He'll see you now. And so I went off thinking this is going to be a great moment where I had images of myself sitting down on Freud's couch, pensively recalling my troubled childhood to a very interested and engaged, psychoanalyst and all the rest of it. And as I was going in, my mom just leaned over and said to me, don't tell him about Dad. He knows Dad, right? And we have spoken, myself and my mom, we have a very close relationship. We've spoken about that moment for many, 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 many years over the course of my young adult and my middle age now. And so I put that in as the opening anecdote in my book, because I thought that was such an important moment. Because when I went in and sat down with the psychiatrist, the first thing he said to me is, your dad's a great writer. And so immediately I was straitjacketed, and I never felt more hopeless, because if professionals were going to be misted by my father's profession and his career and his status, what hope had any of us? Because I thought when I was going there, maybe I might bring the family, maybe the family might get the help it needs, because the reality was we were living with someone who was really struggling and really heavily stuck in addiction. We were living with somebody who had been caught, like many people, in addiction and alcohol. And it was something that really troubled my early development personally. And then as I moved, I never talked about that. And then as I moved into my adult life and I started working in schools and I started to, write for the paper and all that, I remember being at I think it was like 2011 or whatever was the Heineken Cup. I remember standing there watching this match and seeing all the Heineken flags in kids' hands. I remember thinking, like, Jesus Christ, this is like George Orwell. It's like it's some sort of Orwellian nightmare, dystopia. All the kids are there with their Heineken and their Guinness and all the rest of it, waving these flags in their hands and indoctrinating them into this world of alcohol. And this is before I ever said it to anyone. And then I started writing about it for the Irish Examiner, and I started getting a lot of pushback from a lot of people, right, saying that I shouldn't be saying these things, I shouldn't be talking about this stuff, because what I was trying to do is try to crack some of the cultural stuff that's in there about how we normalize drinking. Drinking is the most normalized drug we have. And there's a social aspect to it. And we use it, and it's in the ads, and it's always promoted as this recreational, happy inducing kind of thing. And that was so incongruent to the family that I grew up in and the life that I had as a child. What I had as a child growing up is that alcohol was an incredibly destructive influence on someone who was talented. I could see my father's career, who was a very talented man, sink. I could see his life sink. Eventually, my mom had no other choice but to separate from him, and I just saw his life collapse. And I saw all his friends who were also stuck in alcohol. I saw all their lives collapsing very early, and I was struck by this. As a 19-year-old, as a 20-year-old, I was really struck by the devastation that alcohol brings into people's lives and how normalized it is as a drug. You'd never have the heroin cup, the heroin Six Nations, and when I talk in schools about that, and they can't get their head around that idea. When I talk to young adolescents about how it's normalized and how it's presented to you as something that's harmless, in fact, actually promotes social connection and all the rest of it. But there's a huge aspect to this that we don't talk about, and that we get pushback from vintners. I get pushback a lot from these people when I write about those exact ideas. I get a lot of pushback from it, but I've lived it. I'm not talking just about someone who's worked in schools and gone into psychotherapy and worked with families, because I've done that too. But I've lived the experience of alcohol and alcoholism, and I know what it did to me. And I'm only speaking for myself, here. And for me, very early on, it really ruptured senses of self and it was only, I get kind of emotional when I talk about it because I don't talk about it that often. And it was only when I was on Brendan O'Connor that that he said something to me that really got me. He said, I was talking about my book that was coming out, and Brendan said to me, "Are you a tribe, do you think, children of alcoholics?" And it was the first time I realized I belonged to a group of children out there that had grown up with addiction. And then I work, and I'm very friendly with Katrina Sullivan, who wrote the book Poor. And we would talk at length about our experiences growing up. And she would say to me often, which often gets me, she grew up with parents who were stuck in, heroin addiction and alcohol. And she'd say that the alcohol phases were the worst phases, because alcohol is a depressant and it creates, aggression and stuff. And so as a kid growing up, you never knew what you were going to get coming in the door. And that to me was the most troubling thing. It could be all perfect and it could be all fine. My grandmother lived with us and she was a great Cork woman, and we had great, and I'd go into her and I'd play the guitar to her, and we had all that lovely kind of stuff. And my mom was a very supportive and caring person, trying to hold this whole thing together while she watched her partner collapse into addiction. And that I always think about the tectonic plates. They were never stable. The ground was constantly shifting. And the image that really struck people when I wrote about it in my book, and so many people have written to me about it, I said when I was coming up the estate when I was coming up this hill into my estate in Cork and Douglas, I used to stand on my tippy toes to see if the car was home. And if the car was home, I'd get this sinking feeling because anything could happen. And I didn't think about that image as I wrote it. I just wrote that image into the story of my book. And the amount of people who handwrote me letters saying I did the same thing. I looked up to see was the car there. I constantly checked to see was the car there. I would phone ahead to see was he home or was she home. And so that image of like looking up to see if my father was home was something that was a massive part of my childhood, because you never knew what you'd get. You go in the door, it could be fine, but I was in tune, like Cliona was saying. Trauma, it activates this, the way I always think is it's like the tiger in the car park is the image I have. Is like when you go to the zoo, your frontal cortex allows you to process the fact that you're safe because you have glass in front of you. But if I'm out in the car park and I see the same tiger next to me, all of a sudden it doesn't even get shot up to my cerebral cortex. It stays down in the warning system. And when you grow up in addiction, it's like the tiger is in the car park all the time, and you're constantly looking around for threat and to see if you're safe, and it heightens it. And it heightens your alarm system. It heightens your sense. And I've seen this so many times, Sheila, sitting clinically, and it really gets me. I worked because I've spoken about my own experience with this, and I don't like speaking about it. I'll be honest, I don't like speaking about it, but we have to. We have to speak about it because I've got a platform, and it's important that we do speak about these things. I don't think any of us want people to have a look into our family, with a microscope, because we're secretive and our families are secretive. But there's so many families that are struggling with alcohol addiction. And it's so normalized. It makes me so frustrated. And I do meet the government a lot, and I do speak with politicians a lot, and I do say this to them. We have to stop advertising it. We have to stop promoting it as some sort of social, cohesion substance. Like, there's nothing wrong going for a pint, meeting your friends, but let's be honest, who does that really? It always ends up, generally in my experience, moving towards something else. And in my childhood, I could see my father using it to satiate some difficult early childhood experiences. And so when I was a teenager, I viewed him very linearly, like, bad guy, good guy kind of thing. But as I got older, I started to see his complexity in his life and how complex he was as an individual, and how he leaned on a substance to ameliorate and help him with some early childhood adverse experiences. And that's what happens. And that's the positive psychological feedback loop that is a substance. The thing you use, this is what happens. The thing you use, right? The thing you use to satiate negative feelings or emotions is the thing that spirals your life further into disorganized chaos. And so that you become more emotionally unstable. So you're leaning on it more, and it goes around and around and around in this very terrible loop that you can't kind of get out of. And for years we lived in that, and it wasn't until, and that's why I think talking about it is so important. I went to Rochestown College, Cork, and we were on a retreat, and they brought a father and their son in to talk to us about addiction. This was like probably 1990, 1991. And I remember the son saying something about it. He lived with his father, who was an addict, and the father was there, who'd gotten sober, and had gone to Ashery and gotten sober. And I remember thinking that was the first time I ever used that word, addiction, because in those days you'd say fond of the jar. That was the language. He was fond of the jar. I mean, he, that was the kind of the diminishing of what the family was living with. Yeah, he likes his drink, right? So it was the first time I had the word alcoholism. I remember going home to my brothers and saying this, and it was the first time I had language for what we were experiencing as a family. And if there's any questions there, Sheila, you can throw them out there. Don't make sure you ask there. If anyone asks a question or they want to ask me something, make sure you ask. And so that was important, getting that language for what we were dealing with. And it spiraled and spiraled and spiraled. And I think that's the thing about the positive feedback loop. It just goes down. The bottom can be kind of a kind of an endless concept with an addiction. Sometimes you don't reach it. It just keeps going and going and going, And it disrupted my early attachments with people and relationships. I would love to hear more of. I don't see the end of that question there, Sheila.
Yeah, and indeed, there's a lot of questions actually. Just
just ask them. That's fine. Yeah, just ask them away. Yeah.
Owen, maybe if you're just looking at that actually, because I know you have your computer open. If you want
actually water, it looks like I'm drinking something more powerful. Actually, a big bottle of water in a hotel room. Is there a question, Sheila? Do you want to ask there, or
there's a few questions have come in, Richard. So Eileen wants to thank you for sharing your story and how helpful it is, and she points out that it's important to speak about the secrets that exist within families all over Ireland.
Yes.
And how our experiences help us to turn up for those who come into counselling rooms with a similar story. So she just wants to offer some thanks, and Irene as well. She says she can identify so much with your story. Stephen made a good point. He said, is there any human that is not an addict? Are we not all dopamine addicts? Caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, all of these sources. Is sugar in addiction?
Well, I would probably disagree with that one. Yeah, I think dopamine does run a lot of our behaviors, but I don't think dopamine in a lot of ways will sink your life like alcohol, or bring, when I see my father, he was a good guy. He was a good guy by all accounts, I don't think anything. I think alcohol warps your personality. I think it brings out the worst latent stuff that's in there, and I think the evidence is all there. It can destroy lives pretty dramatically. I don't know about caffeine or coffee. I know what he's saying, having read Dopamine Nation and all that, but yeah, I just think I think a substance, anything that's a positive feedback loop, a substance that changes your personality, is particularly problematic, and we should stop advertising it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I,
I just have a question, three questions. One is from Melanie, then I'll pivot to Marion who can ask it in person.
Sure.
And so Melanie's question is she grew up with she wants to hear more about ACOC as a parent, and she grew up with an alcoholic father. Her father's no longer a drinker, but she's the only person in her family getting therapeutic support. Um she's never been addicted, but she certainly didn't deal with the issues properly until it got to when her kid was 4. Her child is now 11, and she's read that addiction can skip a generation, and she doesn't want that for her child, and she's wondering how do we stop that? She assumes it's not inevitable.
Yeah, I would say just watch that. That's a little bit of early childhood trauma there, in your response to your child. There's no, I don't think that, there's this, inchoate latent gene there going to jump out in your child. The biggest gateway into addiction is early childhood experience. It's not smoking grass or drinking alcohol. That's not the gateway into drugs. The gateway into drugs is childhood experiences. It's attachments to your primary caregiver. Everything in your early attachment as a child is all about the proximity you get to your parent. And so if that's disorganized, or if that's avoidant or anxious, that will cause a bit of a rupture in how you experience and receive love through your life. So there's the thing to be watching out for. And so the fact that you're worried about your child and all that kind of stuff shows that you're kind of, you're very involved in your child's life. So don't try not to think like that. Let your child has to grow up and develop and experience life and all that kind of stuff. You can't be worrying, will they be an addict like that? Because that will position you to be probably overly coddling them and overly protecting them, and they'll resist you massively when they hit 13 and 14. And so I would say just try to relax about that. That's just a bit of your own trauma, and that hasn't been dealt with, or that maybe wasn't validated as a child. And I would say go figure that stuff out. Just because you're the only one going to therapy doesn't mean that you're the only one who needs to have a therapeutic conversation. And so you can often feel the stigma that, well, why am I the only one who is impacted like this? Well, you don't really know, to be honest, and the likelihood is that you're probably not. But we don't process information across the species in the same way. And so when one child can see the father throwing a plate through the window and not be massively impacted, another child could disassociate and have real difficulty with their emotions there. So try to be compassionate to yourself and relax around your child there.
Marion?
Hi, Richard. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. Just listening to everything you said, I completely agree with, especially your discussion around the environmental factors, which Alcohol Action Ireland has been trying very hard for years to be heard in that space. But I was just thinking about, this issue is like mercury. It's very hard to really grasp. We have the children's side of things, and then we have the adult side of things. And it's just when Brendan O'Connor said to you about, are ye a tribe?
Yeah.
I think the amazing thing is that every time somebody like you speaks, people identify very, very significantly. So I keep thinking as well about, I don't know if you know Claudia Black from the States, who says the 3 golden rules of the alcoholic family are don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about that for the early 20s. Like, for many of us, the mental health implications of having grown up in a family often happen in the early 20s when you're starting out in college, or when you're, beginning relationships or whatever. What would you say to, students, let's say, or people in their 20s about the issue? Because the reality of what you've grown up with suddenly begins to hit.
It does.
And there isn't a voice out there that says, you're welcome to our tribe, because nobody wants to be associated.
Exactly.
So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah,
Richard.
no, it's a great point, and you're right. And I even found it hard when I wrote that book. I was so nervous when it started to come out, and then it wasn't until I got the reaction from other people who had gone through it, then I went, oh Christ, that's why I wrote it, right? I kind of relaxed about it then, because I was actually very nervous, because as I said, particularly Irish families, they're so secretive. Now, I did ask my family, can I tell the story? Can I tell my story? And they were like, okay, go for it, because they're very private people, and I knew I was telling their story by proxy by telling my own story. But what I'd say to young people there, if I could go back to that 20-year-old me who really struggled in his 20 years at 20, oh, geez, when I think people often say to me, God, wouldn't you love to be 20 again? And I'd say, Jesus Christ, not a chance. You know, not a chance. I had just caught my father having an affair. I was dealing with trying to figure out what to do with that in the family. The family was collapsing all around us. My grandmother had broken her hip. I took time out of college to kind of help her convalesce. I was basically her care for no, that was not a good time to be a 20-year-old. So I was dealing with a lot of stuff there, and it really weighed heavily on me.
Yeah.
But it also made me resilient in some ways. You know, when
Yeah.
my youngest daughter was born, she had a very rare condition there in 2017, and I remember standing outside the Coombe, and the doctors had told us very terrible news that it wasn't going to be successful and all that. And I remember thinking, oh shit, I wonder have I got the strength to manage this now? And I remember just having that thought, well, you've been down this road before, you know, and you managed it when you were younger, so I think you might have it. And I just relaxed in that moment, and thankfully she's 7 and thriving and full of life. And so, but that early experience stood to me there. You know, I was like, well, you've been through this, you know, you've been through some shite before, so here you go again. And so you maybe you do have it. But what I'd say to a 20-year-old, if I could talk to myself, is go and talk to somebody.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Your family is such a secretive place, and families, you know, you can't talk with your family about these things in some ways. You need to talk to someone who's outside this family and who's doesn't have skin in that game. Go work it out. Figure out the things that you tell yourself about who you are. I would say that's a huge thing. Figure out the story that you're telling yourself. I was telling myself a terrible story, you know, about my ability, about who I was, about fidelity. I believed I developed a very destructive paradigm that all people are cheaters and all people will let you down, and you can't trust any men. I had that idea that men only fucking let you down, and there are none of them that are trustworthy. All of these things I had very early, and I closed off as a person. Like, you couldn't have reached me at 2021. You know, I closed. I was in a relationship with someone who I really liked, and I broke off that relationship because I just didn't want to be around anyone emotionally or anything like that. And so it shut me down for a while. And then as I started to kind of like figure this stuff out. No, I didn't talk to anybody successfully. When I went at 15, that turned me off psychotherapy for life and psychiatry. But in some ways, it motivated me to become one. But that I would have been somebody I needed to be in that room, you know. So I would have been the psychotherapist that I could have gone into and had a conversation with somebody that might be able to kind of, you know, help me with my thinking and my thoughts. And that's kind of the work that really excites me now.
Yeah.
Someone comes in, tells me that they're not that smart, and, you know, we're living with addiction, and I'm the stupid one in the family. You know, that's the stuff that I love, you know, sitting down there with someone and really helping them to see who they could potentially become, because that was me too at 20 years of age, you know, having kind of left college and not knowing what I could do with my life and feeling stuck in a family where there was addiction and there was at times violence and all the rest of it. I felt really stuck there, and I wasn't. And it's amazing how quickly it moves. And that's what I always say to when young adults who say to me, I feel so stuck, I'll say it feels like you're stuck now, you know, but it's amazing how quickly things can change and how quickly you can get distance from something that's so awful. And you look back and you realize that actually you did a few things to maneuver your way out of it. I did myself, and my life changed irrevocably by a bit of good thinking, just a bit of better thinking, and just getting a little bit more precise about what I wanted and moving towards it. I was working in the interest of my future self. I began to stop talking so negatively to myself, and I started, you know, working towards something I wanted to become. I knew I wasn't it there, but I knew what I wanted to become, and so I worked towards it. And I think helping people to get like that, you know, and to getting a bit more precise about what they want and helping them to stop viewing themselves as somehow stuck, because I always go back to the Carl Jung thing. My childhood has happened. I can't change that. But I can change how my relationship with it. I can change how I talk to myself about it. I always think of the Carl Jung phrase. You know, Carl Jung's a great psychologist. You know, you're not your childhood. You're not what happened to you. You're who you choose to become. And that can be frightening for people to think that they have this power and agency and autonomy and who they become. But we all have. And we, you know, and then I started to stop viewing my father also in this linear way of the villain. I started to see him in the matrix of complexity that he came out of. And I started to build a life that was more positive. And I remember saying to myself very clearly, very young, no barman will ever know my name. I had that image because everywhere I went with my dad, oh, hey, Dick, how are things? Every barman knew him. And I remember thinking, no barman is ever going to go, hi, yeah, Richard, as I walk into a pub, my kids with me. That's never going to happen. I'm never going to be a feature at a bar where my life is there. You know, I always wanted my life to be with my kids. And I wanted them to come home and to be excited at the fact that I was coming home. I didn't want them to dread me coming home or, you know, running upstairs to get away from me. And so when I sit down sometimes and the kids come running in and give me a hug and watching TV, I'm like, that's it now. It's fixed. I fixed it.
Amen.
They never know shouting. They don't know aggression. They don't know, plates going through windows. And sometimes my daughter will say, "Dad, you're raising your voice." And I'm thinking, dude, you have no, I don't say it. I think it, you have no idea what a raised voice sounds like, and so they don't live in that experience. And that's healing something from your early childhood.
Yeah. Richard, thank you so much. You mentioned that this platform. I really hope you'll join us again for these further discussions. It's fantastic what you've revealed to us this morning. Thanks a million.
Thanks very much, guys. Appreciate it.
Richard, I just have a few more questions.
Yeah, no worries.
I take them. So Kelly says that she works with a young person growing up with a similar childhood where her primary caregiver is an ex-alcoholic, but she's struggling to connect with her mother now. In retrospect, what advice would you have liked to receive in relation to support from a youth worker? That's one. Breege, do you want me to ask all three, or do you want to take one at a time?
I'll take one at a time. Yeah. So I suppose when you're a teenager and all that, it's what I would be trying to do when I'm working with an adolescent is trying to keep because they can, their brain isn't so fully developed yet, and they do like to think in kind of black and white and good and bad and all that. What I would try to do is I wouldn't try to force them towards anything there. I'd try to hold it and try to like unpack all of their feelings around what kind of a relationship would they like to have and what kind of relationship do they have currently. And I'd try to get them to see their parent in a far more broader way of looking at them than just an alcoholic or an addict. I try to get them to see, and I try to delineate some of the stuff that they do with their parent, because the brain is kind of goes towards negative and I don't have any relationship. That's not necessarily true, I'd imagine. And I try to pick out where do you have a relationship and what is the relationship like when it's going well? And I try to get them to focus in on that so that when they're having a nice moment with their parent, that they can actually become more aware of it and conscious of it. And so that they're not saying, oh, this is all terrible. I would help them with that a little bit, because they can be quite focusing on the negative and what is not present currently. And I just allow, and a huge thing working with adolescents. I mean, what is a great therapist is probably somebody who allows you to have a relationship you don't have yourself with your family, and you sit there and have that relationship with them, and allow them to speak and validate their feelings for them, but again help them to be less narrow in their concepts of what's happening and get them to focus in on what's going well in that relationship. All right.
Brilliant. I have another point here from Bree. She says a very interesting take on each family member's different response to a parent who has alcohol issues. She says she's one of 6, and each of us will have different recollections to various events when we were younger, that involved alcohol misuse. And I suppose it's a point you intimated in terms of writing your book. I suppose if you could just speak to that point a little bit for Bree, I'm sure she'd be delighted.
Yeah, no, actually, Bree, thanks for that. Absolutely. We don't process information and stimuli across the species the same way. I mean, that's what family therapy for me, when you sit down, you talk with a family, you're getting everyone's perspective on what happened or whatever the issue is. And that might be 6 different realities, but you're kind of going, well, there's only one reality here. Well, there's not, it's how you perceive it and how you internalize it and how you then kind of like, interpret it. And and even when you come in the family there, Breed, if you're the youngest or the eldest, that's going to impact on your experience of addiction in the family too, massively. And yeah, so I like, my book actually goes through all of that, my book, and I'm not trying to sell my book here, but it does go through all of that. And it goes through the different levels in the family, the different ages in the family, and the different kind of ways of experience it. But again, yes, we all process it differently, and it means different things at different stages of your life, because you start to process it at different times, and different things are going on for you personally, and your childhood is always quite close to you, and so you're analyzing it all the time, particularly if it's unprocessed. And so I would say, yeah, absolutely, we process it differently, and understanding what it meant for you, and try not to maybe get annoyed at your siblings who don't see it the same way. Just know that in some ways that could be their defense mechanism, to kind of almost managing it, that they might block it out a little bit, or they might disassociate from it a little bit, and so they mightn't want to acknowledge it. For them might be profound, and so just be careful about pushing people to align with your experience, but just know your experience is absolutely valid, and that's what happened for you.
Yeah, and just building on that, Evelina raises a similar point, and she's just wondering if you could mention some of the strategies a family might incorporate to deal with or around alcohol addiction in the family system, on that basis of people perceiving things differently growing up.
Yeah, well, what's the question there? I'm trying to figure that out there.
Yeah, so Evelina says she's noticed similar within her family of their time growing up, they view it very differently. She's just wondering if you could mention some of the strategies a family might incorporate to deal with or around addiction.
Well, you see, you
Family
might
system.
never, yeah, but thanks. You might never align with your family members, your siblings around what happened because it might be very different at different stages of your father or mother's addiction, where whoever's the addict, there is these kind of like, ups and downs with addiction, and depending on the age you were and depending on what was going on in your life, you mightn't be that in tuned to what's going on. So you might have been more in tuned. I was quite attuned to what was going on around me. I was always looking at people's behaviors and how people were feeling. I was always in tune to that. My other brother mightn't have been like that, and so I can't force him to have the same experience as me. And I suppose when I was writing the book, I was saying to him, this is my experience here. And in fact, afterwards, he said, you were too kind. When he read it, he said, you were being very kind there. And I said, well, yeah, I didn't want to be over, I wasn't going for a public penitential here. I was just trying to express what happened to my own experience and what, and so again, watch the desire to have is people be complicit in your experience. You don't need that. You had your experience of growing up with your father or mother who's an addict. It impacted on you the way it did impact on you. Other siblings, it impacted on. It definitely impacted on them. But how they deal with it and how they manage it might be a different intervention than you do. And maybe talking about it and trying to kind of like, work it out that way is important for you. But yeah, so again, it's just like watch your need for other people to in the family system to be the same as you, because they mightn't be able to be that. And so try not to view them as like, well, why don't they have that experience? What's wrong with them? They're denying it or whatever. I'm trying to pull back from that and just say, well, that's their way of processing it. That's their way of dealing with it currently. Who knows what will happen as things change for them as they go through life.
Super. There's a lot of thanks for you, Richard, and I think you'll have increased book sales after this talk. A lot of people pointed to they'll be picking up the book, myself included. Val had some words about the struggle, their struggles around addiction and so forth, and is very thankful for your words today. I just have one final question, and
Sure.
look, bat it away if you feel it's kind
No
of
worries.
outside the scope, but it's around 0.0 alcohol products. Susan is just asking or just stating like that they shouldn't be sold in supermarkets outside the structurally separated zones. And I suppose in your own work or your own perspective, would you have any point to make on that in relation to the use of 0.0 alcohol products to circumvent advertising restrictions and the structurally separated zones in supermarkets?
Let's be honest, they're little hook to get you, to remind you about alcohol. You know what I mean? It's like vaping. They have their hooks all over the place, and they're trying to, get you back in and to remind you about alcohol. And you're walking out and you see the beer in front of you, and oh fuck it, I must get some Tiger Beer. It's not that you're going for the 0.0, and so a rotten hook, absolutely. But this is how they operate. I mean, this is how they operate. I mean, this is how. Burns beer, Guinness. I mean, this is how they work. This is how they're in our society. So not so surreptitiously. They're right there in front of us. They're on everything. They're everywhere. And then advertising. I can't believe. I'm sitting at home and they're advertising a beer and they're showing that life without the beer is crap and life with the beer is brilliant. And that goes against actually advertising standards. But yet they do it and they get away with it because they're constantly pushing it. They're pushing to see what they can get away with. And so placing 0.0 outside is them pushing it to see what they can get away with. And I think we should push it back in and say, no, all alcohol, whether it's alcohol strong or light, whatever it is, goes behind the fence here. And so children can walk around and not see alcohol products in front of them. But let's be honest, children shouldn't go to the dart station either and see alcohol products up in front of them. They shouldn't turn the TV and see alcohol products in front of them. They shouldn't have flags with alcohol products in front of them. We need to get stronger. And I just can't believe we still have it. Obviously, I get angry about it because of my childhood. But I think when I see other children walking around and I see this dystopian stuff around me, it really gets to me, I have to say.
Super. Thanks very much. I might just pass
All right.
to Sheila. She might have a point or two to make on that. I know she's done a lot of work in the area. So
Yeah, well, we do have a strong feelings about the zero alcohol product marketing because we do see it as a con. We see it as their products. I mean, people will like them or not like them. That I don't have a problem with people having them, but when they use identical branding to the parent or the master brand,
Exactly.
that they're getting
It's just
around.
reinforcing it. They've got psychologists that are working on that, Sheila.
Absolutely, absolutely, they have. One last thing that I just wanted to ask you about is, you've trained as a psychotherapist yourself, and you obviously have a huge interest in this area. In your own training or in maybe training that you might be doing with other people, is this a topic that comes up And is this something that you would maybe like to see a bit more?
Definitely. It
You
didn't
know,
come up in my training, Sheila, really, not too much.
well,
No.
that doesn't surprise me because, funny enough, we did a survey actually through with Sharon Lambert actually in UCC, and did a survey of mental health professionals, and about 70% of them had had no training at all
Yeah, no.
in this particular area, and yet we would know, and I know you would know this, that so much of people's health, whether we're talking about depression, anxiety, eating disorders, can often have their roots, back in this. So I was just interested to hear that.
Yeah, and it's terrible because, I think society views addicts as those down in, in heroin and sleeping, outside and all the rest of it. But the reality, the majority of addicts that I work with are functioning and going to work like my father did, and have big jobs, but the whole system is collapsing under it. And that's the reality. And you need really well-trained psychotherapists. I'm well-trained because I've read an awful lot around it and I've written an awful lot around it, but I've lived it. And so, I kind of understand it from the perspective of a child as well and an adult. And so we do need a lot more training as psychotherapists. I think across the board anyway. I don't know, do you get that much training really working with, say, disordered eating and with addiction? So yeah, I think you're right. We need far more, we need better providers there to upskill psychotherapists so that they can work with families in a more successful and hopeful, I mean, that's the thing, a hopeful way.
Absolutely, and I think I'm so glad to hear you just bringing that note of hopefulness.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I find across society in general, if you mention the word alcohol, it's kind of like there's a despairing. Oh, Ireland's always been this way, or we're
Yeah,
always this way.
exactly.
There's always this always. But actually, when you look at the facts and figures on this, firstly, we were not always this way. We do change the level of and the amounts in which we drink because of various factors like price, availability, marketing. These things do change the amount we drink. But more importantly, we know that change is possible, and I think therapeutic support is a huge factor in that. And I was also very happy to hear you just talk about your own resilience and what you developed, within that, because again, there can be sometimes this fatalistic thing of, oh, well, this happened and therefore a disaster will ensue. I think, when you point to your own strengths, and no doubt part of that would have come from the supports that perhaps you received, through other family members, maybe being able to speak up and speak out.
Well, you learn to become very resourceful and rely on yourself, that's one of the things. You learn to rely on yourself. But what can I just land on this last hopeful thing? I think teenagers today are less drinking than, I think they are more interested in, particularly boys, and they're interested in going to the gym. And so I think there's a bit more positivity creeping in there. They probably might have higher levels of binging, whatever it is. But I think drinking, just drinking and all that, I think they've got less. I think it's less in the system than when I was a kid.
There has been a reduction in the overall level of alcohol in the country, and there is a reduction in the age at which young people are starting to drink. So those are definitely positives. I never like to run away too much from this, because we're also very aware that we do have very high levels of binge drinking in Ireland, and sometimes the industry is very keen to use any sign of improvement to say, oh well, sure, then there's no need for any more restrictions, or
no, definitely not.
So there's always a nuanced kind of a thing which we do. Richard, I have to say that has been absolutely fantastic, and I really appreciate you've just given an awful lot of yourself and your own insights, which is hugely informs, I think, the way in which we work, but in which I hope our audience will also be gaining from. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
So we're